Recording. Okay, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Joanne O'Toole, Professor of Modern Language Education in the Curriculum and Instruction Department at SUNY Oswego, New York. Dr. O'Toole is a member of the Executive Committee of the NYS World Languages Content Advisory Panel and the Principal Investigator of the New York State World Language Standards Initiative. Dr. O'Toole has served in several world language leadership positions, including president for the New York State Association for Language Teachers and director for the Northeast Conference on the Teaching of Foreign Languages, and is a regular presenter at national, regional, state, and local conferences. Dr. O'Toole is a certified teacher of Spanish and taught Spanish for 16 years prior to entering post-secondary education. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Dr. O'Toole.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you everyone for being here today. I'm impressed by how many of you decided to join me, so much appreciated. Before we get started, I just want to give you a few pieces of guidance regarding how I'm going to approach this session. First, I'm not going to be reading the chat, except at certain points in the session, because if I had to stop presenting in order to read the chat, I might never get back to presenting. I've seen the New York City World Language Teachers in action. They just love to welcome one another, to make beautiful comments, and to engage actively. I am going to ask you to engage actively, but mentally. There are multiple portions in places in this slide deck where I have thought bubbles, just like a little bubble, like someone's thinking. And when I show those, I'm going to ask you to simply think about the question that I'm asking or the task that we're going to do. Like I'll have a little task, ask you to think about it, give some wait time, and then I'll reveal my responses, and you can compare what you came up with what I came up with. You'll see the title of this is 4 Points for Planning. So it is in 4 parts. So what I will do is I will pause at the end of each part to allow people to enter questions, comments, reflections in the chat. So I will look at the chat at that point and at the end. I will make these slides available to you somehow. I'll ask Jill Schimmel how she's going to get them to you after today's session. So I think that is what I wanted to say to you, and we're going to get started. So again, I've called this 4 Points for Planning. And as I think most of you know, I've been doing a lot of webinars since 2020. I think about 50 of them for New York State World Language Teachers that have all been recorded for the State Education Department. And one of the things that I have discovered is that, well, it's no surprise, right? Just like our students, it takes time for people to be ready to integrate new learning. They need much repetition, they need much time, they need much support. And so that's what this is about. It's about really trying to give you one more way of thinking about integrating the revised New York State Learning Standards, maybe kind of simplifying how you think about that planning. So again, title, 4 Points for Planning with the revised New York State Learning Standards for World Languages. So I do have the workshop description. So I stay honest. I always keep reading my description to make sure I'm actually presenting what I say I'm going to present. So I have 2 goals for today's session. And the first one is to identify 4 key points to guide lesson planning and unit planning aligned to the revised New York State Learning Standards for World Languages. And the second is for you to be able to envision these 4 key points applied in lesson plans at the novice and intermediate levels. I wrote that before I realized this conference really focused on checkpoint A. So along with the slides that I'm going to send, I'm also going to send a lesson plan that embodies all of these ideas. So I want to start here. I spend a lot of time working with world language teachers, whether they be pre-service teachers, in-service teachers. I'm in classrooms all the time. And I often see these two frequent starting places for planning. The first one, vocabulary. The other one, grammar. This may be you. You may be thinking about, oh, it's my food unit, or oh, it's my credit unit. And I've taken the time to think, why do people start there? Because those aren't where our revised learning standards ask us to start. So let's take a look at this. In 1986, and some of you who've been around for a while may be familiar with Modern Languages for Communication, our state syllabus, it had this guidance on page 3. Rather than teaching students vocabulary words or grammatical structures in isolation, teachers are urged to help students regard and use the modern language as a tool that will enable them to accomplish a specific communicative purpose in a particular form and setting about a particular subject. And the focus is always on what the students can do with the language and how well they can do it. In the words in blue, I've added a specific communicative purpose is a language function. A particular form is grammar, and form also can refer to vocabulary. Context, topic, and content are where we typically connect the vocabulary because we need vocabulary specific to a context or specific to a topic or content. And what learners can do with the language and how well they can do it, well, that's about proficiency. And so that last sentence reminds us that the purpose of our teaching is to promote our learners' proficiency. So we can see that starting with vocabulary, starting with grammar, has been something that the state education department has asked us not to do since 1986. So why did teachers shift away from this 1986 guidance? It is 2025. Well, some of us, especially those who are older like me, we were taught via really grammatical focuses. So I learned initially by the audiolingual method, which was all about repetition. So it's very typical that teachers are most comfortable teaching the way they were taught. I used to teach AP Spanish when I was a high school teacher, and until 2014, the AP College Board had the language exam for various world languages focused on a grammatical syllabus. They really emphasized vertical alignment. And so for the district where I taught, I actually created a vertically aligned grammatical syllabus. That was in the 1990s and early 2000s and up until, well, I left public school teaching in 2004. But you can see that, we've got New York State saying one thing, but teachers who are teaching AP and really being encouraged to create this vertical syllabus are being told something else. Then, of course, there are textbooks. And so this is a screenshot of a textbook. And you'll see, even though they've called the theme, Let's Go Camping, the very first thing they list is the vocabulary. After that, they list the grammar. And then it's after that, they say, oh, let's put that all together. So they're starting with the vocabulary and grammar. And for people who perceive a textbook as a curriculum or the primary guidance for their teaching, it makes sense that they might think that they should start their planning with vocabulary or grammar. And then, of course, if you're like me, my life is a constant battle between wanting to correct grammar and wanting to have friends. I love grammar. I'm a grammar nerd, and I think a lot of us who are language educators just love words. We love grammar. We love anything linguistic. So there's clearly a lot of reasons why we may have shifted away from that 1986 guidance. So I want you to think about planning with the revised learning standards, and should they make you feel anxious, This is just a little video for some deep breathing. And then I ask you to kind of follow along with me as I walk you through 4 points for planning. And I decided to use the pinwheel because I was trying to think of an image or a metaphor that happened to have 4 points. Well, I have 5 fingers on my hand and I have stars with 6 points, but I found a pinwheel with those 4 points. And so that's going to be our metaphor. And so what I love about the pinwheel is that we just move from one space to the next seamlessly. And so that's how I want you to think, excuse me, about these 4 points. They're not separate. One moves into the other, moves into the other, moves into the other, and they all come together to support standards-based planning. Number one, functions first. Number two, real and relevant. Number three, comfort and stretch. And number four, repetition that's not repetitious. So I'm going to give you a moment. You don't necessarily know what all of these mean right now, but I want you to just have those in your head as we move forward. Our 4 points for planning. Okay, so let's look at functions first. I'm going to start by defining the functions. We actually saw the definition in that statement from New York State Education Department. A language function is a specific purpose for communication. And as this point states, we need to first and foremost think about what is our learner's purpose for communication. Notice it's not the grammar, it's not the vocabulary, it's our communicative purpose. And so why functions first? Well, I'm going to share with you 7 different reasons, and then we're going to, excuse me, and then we're going to take a closer look at them. Starting with, when we have our functions first, it makes communication primary. It identifies the specific purpose for the communication. It also identifies the learning standard. And again, that's one of our goals today is to think about those 5 learning standards. It creates the need for a communicative context. We need to communicate about something. It also suggests a grammar focus. And some of you may have been worrying, like, oh no, where does the grammar go? Now you're starting to see. Language functions also drive the task designs and assessment designs. So you can see there's great power in those language functions. But first, why do language functions matter? The brain. The brain seeks meaning. And so if communication and purposeful communication is primary, we're putting meaning first. So here are our revised New York State Learning Standards. And remember, one of the points was that the language functions identify the learning standard. How is that? Look at that. Every one of our 5 learning standards embeds 1, 3, 4, or 5 language functions. They're written right into the standard. Let's take a closer look. Oh, wait a minute. There is a thought bubble here. So before I give you the answers, those of you who've been working with these standards, who've been engaging in our workshops, I want you to take a moment to think about how many of the language functions you can recall that are associated with our communication standards. Again, the thought bubble is just think. So I'll give you a moment to think. Well, interpretive communication, as our icon tells us, that's input. It's what our learners are listening to, viewing, reading. And there are three communicative language functions here. We want our learners to understand, we want them to be able to interpret, and we want them to be able to analyze what they have heard, read, or viewed. Interpersonally, our icon shows us that we have two or more people who are exchanging information. That's our first language function. And perhaps exchanging information to express feelings, preferences, or opinions. It's a back and forth. And presentationally, we see those arrows going out. So it's one individual who's sending a message to an audience. And they may be describing, informing, narrating, explaining, or attempting to persuade that audience. Wait a minute. These are our culture standards. But I've written at the top, language functions to identify the purpose for communication. You may recall that the culture standards start with the words, learners use the language to. In other words, culture is not separate from communication. We have to use one of the communication standards or more in order to carry out the culture standards. And so for culture standard 4, what three language functions are you recalling? Take a moment to think about it. Identify at checkpoint A, describe at checkpoint B, and explain at checkpoint C. Notice how this is one time the language functions are by proficiency target, because we know that our checkpoint A, our novice learners, identifies probably all that they can do, name, list. But as learners build proficiency, there's more they can do with language as it relates to culture. And I bet you can all come up with the cultural comparisons language function. It is simply compare. And one of our other points was that language functions create a need for communicative context. And we see that when we take a look at our standards-based can-do statement formula. It's I can, followed by a language function, not grammar, not vocabulary, a language function associated with whichever standard you happen to be using, and a context, because we must communicate about something. And so here's an interpersonal communication example. I can exchange opinions. Remember, exchange opinions was one of our interpersonal language functions about Bad Bunny's new album. I happened to be in Puerto Rico when it came out. Boy, was that ever a buzz. And so that's a meaningful context. So you may be thinking, are those language functions you listed, the ones in the standards, the only ones that I can use? Well, we have this document, and again, I'll share this when I share the slides. It's also on the State Ed website, and it's linked below, that anything that kind of means the same thing can be used in replacement of whatever language function is in the standards. So for example, on the last slide, I had exchange opinions. But if I look over here under interpersonal communication, it says express opinions. Wait a minute, I can agree or disagree. I can ask for someone's opinion. I can brag. I can criticize. I can express boredom. You know what? Sometimes picking an alternate language function may even be much more interesting to your students. I remember teaching my 7th graders how to make excuses. Now, we didn't see make excuses in any of the standards, but I was trying to explain, have my learners be able to explain why they didn't do this or didn't do that. Think of homework. Oh, they loved making excuses. So we can use alternate language functions or alternate verbs for our language functions to expand how we can express the language functions to our students and have them express their meaning. So suggest a grammar focus. Because again, today is really emphasizing checkpoint A, I wanted to point out that at checkpoint A, most grammar is taught as unanalyzed language chunks. You'll notice that I have the icons for both interpersonal and presentational communication. These are our two output standards. We don't typically teach grammar for interpretive communication or for cultural communication. It really is associated with our two output-based standards. So I want you to take a moment to think about what grammatically you might teach learners interpersonally to be able to exchange information, to express preferences, and presentationally to describe or persuade. And think about checkpoint A. I'm going to have you get some ideas in mind, and I'll show you what I came up with. Let's take a look. So again, checkpoint A, mostly unanalyzed language chunks. So for exchange information, I'm probably just going to teach my students memorize questions and answers or sentence starters. If this were to be analyzed like I might do at the intermediate level, como se llama? Se llama, which has been memorized at checkpoint A, might be me teaching my learners reflexive verbs. So that's the difference between analyzed, reflexive verbs. How do they work? Unanalyzed. Oh, you're going to memorize this question and you're going to memorize this sentence starter. So grammar looks different at checkpoint A than at checkpoint B. Expressing preferences, I might give my students sentence frames with more than and less than. Me gusta dormir más que estudiar. I like to sleep more than study. And so again, I might give them the chunks, more than, less than, in a sentence frame that they fill in the blank. Later on, at the intermediate level, analyzed, I would teach them comparatives and superlatives and when to use más que and más de and menos que and menos de and put the direct, the definite article to move from comparative to superlative. But that's later on. But describe. Now at checkpoint A, this is a place where I might actually have them engaged with analyzed language, where I'm teaching them adjective agreement and word order. Los gatos blancos, the white cats. And so which definite article or indefinite article goes with which noun and which adjective ending and where do I put the adjective? I would probably explicitly teach that at checkpoint A. And then to persuade. What about teaching learners an expression like to have to, followed by an infinitive? So tienes que hacer tu tarea. You have to do your homework. Persuade. So again, memorize chunk, and all they do is replace that infinitive. But in every case, notice how the grammar wasn't grammar for grammar's sake. It was so the learners could carry out a language function. And so where do I put a grammar in a can-do statement? Or even can I put grammar in a can-do statement? Remember, grammar is always in support of the language function. So in a lesson plan, if I want to include grammar, it would have to be, again, in an output-based standard. I can language function plus context, which we've already done, using whatever grammar I want to name. So here's an example. Going back to interpersonal communication, I can persuade someone to do something. So there's I can, language function, context, using tener que with the infinitive. And so that's the place of the grammar. in support of the language function. And finally, language functions drive both the task and the assessment design. So here's my can-do statement. I can convince someone to do something. I can, language function, convince, and my context. So getting someone to do something. Alrighty. This is an interpersonal task. And wait a minute, I put task and assessment on the same slide. Don't forget, assessment should be a mirror of the tasks that learners do throughout instruction. My students used to say to me, Senora, isn't this what we've been doing? Like, yes, that's what we're assessing. We're assessing, have you learned what we have been practicing, performing in class? So this could be an in-class task. This could be an assessment. We are friends and we are discussing our weekend plans. Try to convince me to do your preferred weekend activities. You'll see the language function, but in this case, the learner's implied because the students have to think, well, what structures do I know? What language do I know that I can use to try to convince someone? And if you've been practicing tener que, they may very well pull that up or something else. And then, of course, we can see the context of weekend plans. Let me show you a variation on this. Let's use this can-do statement. I can convince someone to do something using tener que with the infinitive. We are members of a school club, and we're discussing our responsibilities for an upcoming event. Suggest the tasks you think I should do in preparation for the event using tener que. First of all, I want you to notice the language function is suggest. Wait a minute, suggest wasn't anywhere in the standard. Remember, it's one of those alternative language functions. So I can use different language for this same purpose. And I have my context. We're talking about the context of responsibilities for a school club event. And I can explicitly include the language function. It may be that this is the way we practice, and then when we get to the assessment, we go back to the one where it's implied and see if students use it, or we can explicitly request it throughout. But in the real world, in real world communication, nobody's asking your students, oh, make sure when you answer me, you use tener que. So that's something to think about. All right, so I'm going to pause for a moment because we've come to the conclusion of talking about, and I'll even stop sharing, of talking about functions first. So take a moment to think about what was new to you, or what were your ahas, or what's a takeaway, and go ahead and throw that in the chat. And if you have a question about functions or anything I just said, you can throw that in the chat as well. So I love this question about applying this to sign language. Sign language, American Sign Language, uses the very same standards. You'll actually notice for interpretive communication, it's reading, listening, receiving, viewing. And so think about how you have your learners sign to be able to carry out the language functions. They're just going to use it with signs rather than the written word or the spoken word. Anyone else? Thank you. I really appreciate that comment. Yeah. Putting those descriptions together. All right, the chat's particularly quiet, so I'm going to go back to point number 2. So functions first. So somebody's asking about teaching ELLs. So the first thing I need to tell you is that what I am presenting to you is specific to the New York State Learning Standards for World Languages. And in teaching ELLs, you are clearly teaching language functions. You're doing it in particular more in relationship to content rather than context. So stop and think about what language functions are required for the learners to carry out the tasks in particular content. So the by, Wilma, I love that you added that. The by has to do with the acceptable evidence. How will they show that they have done that? I haven't included that in this session, but absolutely that can be part of it. So the can-do statements that I've shown you, stop right before you get to the acceptable evidence. And students must have a prior vocabulary. So this is not a session on vocabulary, and I'm not saying that we ignore vocabulary, because just like the grammar is in support of the language function, vocabulary is in support of the context. And so absolutely in a vocabulary session, we would talk about that. But we don't start with, oh, my food unit, what words do I need? No, no, no. What do I want my learners to be able to communicate using a language function? What is the context? And we're going to come back to that in a little bit. And what words do they need to be able to do that? So this is not so much about your teaching as your planning. Okay, so let's get on to the next section. And we're going to be talking about making it real and relevant. So why does real and relevant world language learning matter? We're going back to the brain. I'm going to come to the brain each and every time. That the brain seeks connections. And those connections can be to my personal experiences. They can be to my life outside of the classroom. They need to be to my world, right? Our learners need to feel that what they're learning connects to their lives in some way. Here are some really big ideas that when the learning is real and relevant, it connects learners. It engages them mentally. And once they're mentally engaged, they're engaged with one another in the content. It makes it more interesting to them. It expands their worldview. It gives purpose to their learning. It piques their curiosity, and many, many more. And there's one more I have in here, and it's transferable, because this real life situation may be similar to this other real life situation and this other real life situation. And so we always want to think about transferability. So I'm going to go back to that very last sentence in the guidance from State Ed from 1986. And it said, the focus is always on what the students can do with the language and how well they can do it, which we know refers to proficiency. And here are the ACTFL proficiency guidelines, and some of you may be familiar with the ACTFL inverted pyramid of different proficiency levels. And in New York State, we worked with the ACTFL proficiency guidelines to develop our performance indicators. And so novice and intermediate, moving towards advanced, are the focus of our standards and our performance indicators. But how does ACTFL define proficiency? Let's take a look. Quote unquote, what one can do with language in real world situations, in spontaneous, non-rehearsed contexts. You'll notice it's about real world communication. Now, our classroom isn't always filled with real world communication, but it's all of those performances in the classroom that help build learners' proficiency so they can transfer it into real world communication. Many of you in New York City teach learners for whom the language you're teaching is their home language or their heritage language. And so there may be much more real world communication taking place every day. And of course, as teachers, when we engage in real world sorts of ways with our learners, just checking in, how are you doing? How was the game? We have all of those real world situations as well. So proficiency is all about real world. So how do we create in our planning real and relevant world language learning? Thematic planning. Thematic planning means that what we're planning for our learners to learn is communicatively purposeful, leading with language functions, leading with meaning, like we've already talked about, that it's culturally contextualized, that culture is a communicative context. It's what we're going to talk about, and we're integrating authentic resources to do so. Thematic planning is intrinsically interesting, that we've designed something that's going to pique our learners' curiosity and that's relevant to them. Cognitively engaging it taps into what they know. Now, they may not always have the language to be able to say what they know, but that's why we scaffold and support. And of course, it's standards-based. So here's our thought bubble again. A really not easy way, but an important way to come up with meaningful themes is to take our topics, like you might find in the New York State World Language Themes and Topics, and not use them singularly. So if I said, oh, this is my shopping unit, what that does is it really just identifies a context. And when I think about context, I think about vocabulary. But wait a minute, functions are first, not vocabulary. So instead, what I want to do is I want to think about, how do I put shopping together with other topics to create a meaningful theme, something that would pique my learners' curiosity, something that would engage them, something that would give them something to communicate about. Take a moment to think about what shopping could be combined with, what other New York State World Language themes and topics to create a unit theme, something meaningful to learners. Give you a moment to think about that. Here's my idea. The perfect gift. I'm going to combine shopping, travel, and family and social relationships. So in this instruction, I can plan for my students to be traveling, looking at what authentic gifts, crafts, souvenirs they might be able to choose, and for whom, what matters to family members or friends, and what gift would be perfect for them and why. And what do we have to know culturally about purchasing gifts, and how do I respect the artisans who may have made them? Might I think about fair trade? Lots of possibilities, very meaningful. Even if that travel is local, it might be right in my own community, because not every learner can travel to a target culture, but New York City has so many microcosms of the cultures of the world. How about this one? Physical environment, climate, weather, geography. What could be a theme? What topics might I bring together? I came up with the wonders of nature. So clearly I'm using physical environment, climate, weather, geography, communities and neighborhood, leisure. What I'm thinking about is I'm focusing specifically on the geography. What's the geography near where I live, in my community, where I can go? What which geographical features do I most prefer and why? And what do I like to do there in terms of leisure activities? And what geography exists in target cultures? And what do people do there? Um, Great authentic resource I found, and again, I'm going to be sharing the unit plan that lesson plan that goes with this, is a photography contest from Mexico. Although I also have photography contests, which they apparently have all over the world, that are nature photography contests, so that our learners can really see not only nature as it would appear in maps or on websites, but in terms of what people think is valuable and they've taken photographs of. And maybe our learners take photographs of the geography in their communities and what they're proud of and where they want to go for leisure activities. So another way I can make it real and relevant is by using authentic resources. So here are some authentic resources about clothing that's made from fabric from cactus. Sneakers, backpacks. Our learners have sneakers, our learners have backpacks. But wait a minute, these are vegan and they're made from cactus, and people buy them. And so notice the piquing of curiosity. Does everyone have these? Is this affordable? What about the sustainability? So many possibilities. Again, it's real, it's relevant, and it would pique their curiosity. So I'm going to stop a moment and give you an opportunity to think about what resonated with you, questions you may have related to the notion of real and relevant. Take a moment for anything people want to enter in the chat. Well, I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so we will go on. Comfort and stretch. So why does comfort and stretch matter in world language learning? Oh, the brain again. You know, when our students are stretched way too much, in other words, what we're asking them to do is far beyond what they have developed proficiency to be able to do, there's a really increased cognitive load demand. And the brain doesn't work well when there's too much cognitive demand. So the brain is really optimized when we decrease that cognitive load. So what do I mean by comfort and stretch? This is a quote from Meg Malone, who works for ACTFL. And she said, instructors need to target instruction across two ranges, broadening learners' performance at their current range and working to develop some abilities at the next higher range. So let's take a look at this. Here are our performance indicators. And so imagine that you are teaching at Checkpoint A, the second course, which has a target of Novice High. So you're going to look for every one of the standards. What does it say that learners at Novice High should be able to do? So this is what you're aspiring for your learners to do. For example, interpretively, I can identify the topic and some isolated facts in short informational and literary texts. So when I'm having my students engage in interpretive communication, I would plan for them to identify the topic, identify isolated tasks, and so on. And so I would go through my performance indicators. That's comfort. That's where our learners are. Now, I will say, caveat, that's not where all of our learners are, because we know there's variation among our learners. And so, again, for the purpose of my illustrating this point, I'm going to envision that we have learners that we're planning for at Novice High. we can use this document for differentiation very, very clearly. But what's stretch? Comfort is stretch is when we start where they are. So say we're planning at Novice High, and we do this, and one of our next points is that repetition without being repetitious. And so that idea that we use these performance indicators to guide our planning, build our learners' comfort, have them comfortable where they are, and we move them to that next proficiency target. So what is it that I now want to push my students to be able to do? We'll look again at interpretive communication. I can identify the topic, main idea, and related information from simple sentences and short informational texts. Now, I might do that by scaffolding them, but I'm going to move them from where they are to that next proficiency level. And the more I do that, by the end of the course, they're really going to be at that next proficiency level. But I shouldn't stop there. Let me give them a preview of where they're going. And again, this is where our sentence frames and our sentence starters and our anchor texts really come in, where we can model, but we want to be moving them from where they are to that next proficiency target. One of the key strategies for this is our wonderful gradual release of responsibility model. I do. This is where you as the teacher are modeling a task. We do. Let's all do it together with teacher support. You do it together. So with peer support, they're doing the task, and they're probably doing it with a great deal of guidance. And then they may be doing it alone for individual accountability, but not always alone, because clearly interpersonal communication is never done alone. We can also use what's called spiraling. We start within the level. So we might ask our students, where do you like to go in your free time? Who do you go with? When do you go there? Notice I'm answering where and who and when, and I could actually answer these at the word level, which is what novice communication is. But let me spiral it. Oh, where do you like to go in your free time? Tell me about your favorite place to go in your free time. What is a typical afternoon like there? What do you like most about this place and why? Every one of those answers has to be done at the sentence level. So I'm spiraling my learners into the intermediate level. Again, I might do that initially using sentence starters, or using sentence frames, or using model sentences. Or elicitation, where I ask my initial question at the novice level, where do you like to eat? And then my follow-up question at the next level. I've never been there. Tell me about it. So I'm eliciting more speech. What foods do they serve? Oh, which is the best to order and why? So again, my prompts, my elicitations are intended to move them from where they are to that next level. Comfort, stretch. So I will pause again and see what reflections, comments, questions people may have about comfort and stretch. Feel free to enter into the chat box. So I do see one question from previously about the best website to get the best authentic resources. That's a whole webinar unto itself. And I will say that in New York State, we have, let me see if I can grab it quick. An authentic resources Wakelet. And a Wakelet is an online platform. And even though this person asked me the question privately, I will put the link to the Wakelet in the chat. And Leslie Gran, who was your keynote speaker, she also has wonderful authentic resources on her Pinterest site. But my personal experience is I use Google like I would use it for real world purposes. So I ask it questions, and I do it so frequently that Google and on my phone and my Facebook feed, it thinks I'm a native speaker of Spanish because it's always sending me things. And then I follow other people. I know there's also a authentic resources for Spanish teachers on Facebook. That is run, yeah, that is quite wonderful as well. So I'm just going to leave that for right now because I have a few more things to say because we have a final and fourth point. And somebody was asking for examples of comfort and stretch at checkpoint B. I actually have them on the webinar that if you've ever seen our state ed webinars, let me just real quickly. State ed webinars, professional learning, recordings of professional learning 2021. We did a webinar on understanding checkpoint proficiency targets. So this is a webinar that may be of interest to the person who asked that. Okay, so let's get back. Let me get my PowerPoint back open because I switched around a little bit. And let's do the last one. Of course, it would help if I clicked the right button here. Sorry about that. Okay, and so the last of the 4 points, I think is oh, and of course I spelled this wrong. 1 second. Shame on me. Okay, repetition, that's not repetitious. There. I think this is my favorite. And I will give Laura Terrell credit for this because I read it in an article from her. So why does repetition that's not repetitious matter in world language learning? Well, first of all, the brain seeks patterns. And so if the learner sees something over and over again, that repetition will form a pattern. However, when there's repetition, like think about you have classroom procedures and routines, that's repetition. It decreases cognitive demand, and we want that brain to be optimized. But we don't want to be repetitious. Why? Because when we're repetitious, the learners get bored. And when learners are bored, all learning shuts down. So repetition that's not repetitious through multiple yet varied passes. Let's take a look where we go from input-based learning tasks to output-based learning tasks. We start with interpretive, which is input-based. We move to interpersonal. We move to presentational. We move back to interpretive. And we do this in a cultural context, and it really scaffolds our learners towards lesson and unit goals. So let me give you an example. This comes from Rebecca Bluewolf's article, which I happen to have in my hand, called Going Deep with Novice Learners. And I'm going to get my glasses on because I'm going to read to you very briefly. So not only is the article is Going Deep with Novice Learners, reimagining a school unit with authentic resources. And so she says, first, my students watched the video, and she had found the video that I have linked up there. And it's a video of a middle school day in France from the point of view of an 8th grade middle school learner. First, my students watched the video without audio and completed a processing guide where I asked them to answer true-false questions by focusing on visuals, and 2, establish the order of a French school day. So we have one video and we have 2 tasks. First time, we're answering true-false questions about the visual. The second time, we're sequencing the events of the French school day. Notice how these are being done with one authentic resource, 2 tasks, but no audio. Next, students watched the video with audio and completed a second processing guide for which they needed to gather more specific information, like what time students take the bus to school, the number of teachers they have, and to make cultural comparisons. So this is a second pass through the same video, this time with audio, gathering facts about the school day and people at the school, and making cross-cultural comparisons. And finally, I provided students with true-false statements in French, and they circled and read aloud the statements they felt were true for French schools. I also provided sentence starters such as, in French schools, the teachers are, and in French schools, it's important too. So notice how a third time through this video with the audio, she has 2 more tasks, circling the true statements about French cultural practices and completing sentence starters to identify cultural perspectives. This was all done in the interpretive mode. She has learners demonstrating that they understand, that they can interpret, and that they can analyze. All 3 language functions are here, and notice all of the repetition, and none of it was repetitious. Here's within the interpersonal mode. I have an infographic about humanizing pets, and students might first express a preference for cats or dogs with reasons in conversation with a partner. They might then exchange information about pets they have had, or would like to have by surveying their classmates. They might express opinions with a partner about how pets should be treated with examples, and they might debate whether pets should be humanized or not with reasons. Again, repetition without being repetitious. Here's an example within the presentational mode. And we have a photograph from Peter Menzel, What the World Eats. And this is a Guatemalan family and the food they purchase for a week, or maybe even harvest for a week. So list what this Guatemalan family eats in a week. Document what your family eats in a week. Compare what the Guatemalan family and your family eat in a week using a graphic organizer. Draw a conclusion about which family has a healthier diet and give reasons why. And one last example, repetition that's not repetitious by integrating the standards. I'm going to skip this slide because I've already shown it to you. So this time it's across the modes of communication. So exchange ideas with a partner of what you think the photo and accompanying article are about and why. Notice how they're not seeing the article yet. This is interpersonal. They're exchanging ideas with a partner. Create questions you want answered by the article. So this is both interpretive and presentational because they're interpreting the visual and they're writing the questions. Then they're going to read the article, answer the questions, and summarize key ideas. This is interpretively. And express preferences for which items you would purchase for your ekeko, which is the little minor god from the Aymara culture, and why. And this might be interpersonal if we're exchanging those ideas. It could also be presentational if you had the learners writing the ideas. Again, we've got repetition, but none of it is repetitious. And finally, culturally, compare las alacitas and New Year's practices here in the US. So we had 4 points in planning. Functions first, real and relevant, comfort and stretch, and repetition that's not repetitious. And our goals for today were to identify 4 key points to guide lesson planning, align to the revised New York State Learning Standards for World Languages, and to envision them applied. And again, I will be sending you, let me stop sharing, a lesson plan that these would be applied, all of these concepts are applied with, as well as the slides and the other resources people were asking for. And yes, I saw 3 minutes left. I went 1 minute over. I'm going to apologize for that. I want to thank you for being an amazing audience, and thank you for being here today. I hope you found this useful.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. My colleague Anthony Pizarro put in the chat if you would like to share your takeaways on the Padlet. Anthony, if you don't mind putting that in the chat again. Also, the attendance code is also on there as well. Put that on Pro Learner to be able to get your attendance for CTLE. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Excuse me, where did you say is the code for the attendance? I'm sorry.
Anthony Pizarro is going to put it back in the chat.
Working on it.
Thank you, Anthony.
So how do we use this code?
I'm going to put the instructions in the chat as well. We would have to go into Pro Learner. So you go into Teach Hub, open up your Pro Learner, go on the left side, you'll see enrollments. You click on My Enrollments. Let me go ahead and put the instructions in the chat. That might be easier. Let me put it under Anthony so that it's not in different places. Just copy his. If you go on that link right under Anthony's comment, you'll see how to do that. Pages 6 through 7 explains how to do that. Stop the recording.